I don't care if it's a $5 million sale or a $100 million sale. I get the same big question from business owners when they're approaching a sale of their business. It's not, what are you going to do with my investments, or how much can you save me in taxes? It's, will I have enough? Do they have enough money to live the life they want to live? Can they now buy the house? Can they help their parents? Can they pass along money to their kids without ruining them, of course? Can they start a new business if someone in their family wants to do so? What happens if the market crashes? What happens if the tax rates change? So all of these questions are rooted in fear, because there's a big difference between what that number says on the LOI and what they actually get to keep, and then how they're going to manage their financial situation into the future. And frankly, no one does the work quantitatively to understand this. I'm Nick Bartolo, the founder of Essential Partners. After spending 17 years on Wall Street, analyzing businesses and forecasting businesses, at Essential Partners, my wealth management firm, we manage money for business owners after the sale. And over the past 16 months, our client partners have executed over $500 million of business sale transactions. Today, we're going to walk through a case study of someone I met at a lawn and landscape event who's approaching a business sale. And ultimately, his question was not about tax and not about investments, but will I run out of money? So I want to walk through this, and we're going to do it a little bit differently this time. I'm going to pull up some software, and this is just like general industry software that we use, but then we filter it and also use our proprietary system where we can actually compare what's in the software with no tax strategy to actually what we do in our proprietary essential tax framework, so business owners can pay less tax and make more money. Here's the setup. It's a $19 million transaction, which I can imagine you're already saying, like, $19 million transaction? How could they ever be worried about running out of money? But here's why. 19 million, 2 million is planning on being rolled into the private equity backed company that's acquiring his business. Okay, so now we're down to 17 million. And after 17 million, luckily, this owner is in a state, Texas, where there's no state tax rate. So if we were to just get out my trusty old school HP 12C calculator here, you start with 19 million, you're down to 17 million. If there's a 20% tax rate with no tax planning, that is $3.4 million in taxes. So just on taxes alone, we are down to $13.6 million. He's only 40 years old and his wife's 38. So we're talking about a long retirement. So you can throw all of the benchmarks and all the rules of thumb out the window. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the 4% rule. Well, here it is, Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner. If you sell your business and you just take 4% out of your account every year for the rest of your life, you're good. You'll never run out of money. Guess what? You're not necessarily good, because the 4% rule is not built for business owners. It's not built for young entrepreneurs that grew their business and were able to have a $19 million exit like this at 40 years old. It's built for people that have a 30-year retirement. This particular client and his wife, they may have a 50-year retirement. With modern technology, they may have a 60-plus year retirement. So the 4% rule and any other rule of thumb, you could throw it out the window. So let's get back to this example. 40 years old, retired. I assumed a 90-year-old life expectancy, but that could be longer, as we just talked about. And I wanted to keep this example really straightforward to see what the conventional approach and just this standard software spits out. So you have the service owner and his wife. Now let's go to the net worth. I directly put in just like after tax amount with no tax planning, $13.6 million, as we discussed. Further, you can see we can make assumptions about how this money grows. On an after fee basis, I assumed a relatively conservative 7% growth rate, which the thing about business owners is that the conventional approach doesn't necessarily apply, because you can't just go out with a business owner and say, hey, Mr. Business Owner, I know you're 40 years old, but we're going to put you in 100% US stock market equity portfolio because you're so young and you have a long retirement, and we want you to have the highest returns possible. inevitably, Murphy's Law would suggest that you put that money in the stock market and the stock market goes down 30 or 40%, like it has many times through history. And so for a business owner, you have to start much more conservative and gradual. So in this case, though, over a very long-term horizon, I don't want to plan for an overly aggressive scenario. So we start with 7% after all fees. Let's save that. Moving on. Income. Most business owners, some have contributed to Social Security over time. Actually, a lot have. But in this example, we're just going to assume no income from Social Security and no outside income sources, just to keep the analysis clear. Oftentimes, what I see is that business owners do have Social Security coming in, and a lot of times they might own some real estate, whether that's real estate they owned in their business that the company that acquired them is now paying them to lease out to run the business, which can be a nice source of income, or maybe they have a few rental properties or other business interests. But in this case, to keep it simple, we're just going to use zero and no outside income. Now let's get to expenses. This business owner told me that he wants to spend $650,000 and that right now he's spending something similar, slightly less, because he was thinking of upgrading a few aspects of his life. And so $650,000 was the number that he wants to spend in order to live the life that he's earned from running this business, or that he thinks he wants to live, and no judgment on that. So $650,000. But that $650,000 is not the $650,000 that you'll be spending 10 or 20 years from now. So we grow that number. In this case, let's just go to the details here. You can see this number grows at 2.7%, just a proxy for inflation and what that spending is likely to increase over time. So you can imagine, like, think about $650,000 today. Again, back to the calculator, growing 2.7%, let's say over 20 years. In 20 years, that 650 is 1.1 million. So the spending obviously goes up substantially. And while the software doesn't have this capabilities, what we always model is a spending smile, meaning at the beginning, your spending is high and likely growing, but later in your life, let's say at 75, 80, 85 years old, your spending actually starts to decline. So you can't travel as much. You don't want to buy as many things. You're fortunately not doing quite as many activities, going out as much as you used to. And so it is a life reality where you should be enjoying it while you can, but it's also a financial reality in that later in life, you're likely to have, higher medical expenses, but all the other expenses go down drastically. So we typically model that in our proprietary model. On this software, we just assume 2.7% growth indefinitely into the future. And again, that is a bit more conservative. That's it. We have the tax rates built into this, all of the federal tax rates. Since he's a Texan, him and his wife are Texas residents, you have no state tax. And so let's go to the output and what this actually looks like when we project it into the future. That doesn't look good. Okay. So starting off with $13,600, spending $650,000, which is growing at 2.7%, assuming no other assets, no other income sources. Typically in a real life case study example, there'll be a house and a mortgage and debt pay down associated with that. Again, there may be other business interests. Social Security might come into play. We can directly model a travel budget, all types of different variables that you can build out in this model. But for these purposes and the conversation I was having with this gentleman, who he knows what portion of his budget is travel. That's, what portion of that 650 is travel and all the other litany of expenses. Okay. So I wanted to keep it simple for him to keep him focused, because again, he didn't really want to talk about investment strategy, didn't really want to talk about tax strategy, wasn't necessarily fluent in all of those topics, which I'm not fluent in running his business either. So to keep it simple, let's look at this graph. You can see, like, starting at 40, boom, that's not good, right? That's going down fast, but is it good? Is it normal? So 7% returns, expenses growing at 2.7%. Guess what? The 4% rule in this very smooth case actually works. And as I mentioned before, it's a 30-year retirement. So lo and behold, after 30 years, because that's what the 4% rule is based on, you run out of money after 30 years. Okay. So obviously that spending is too high given no tax planning and this level of spending. As someone who's 40, running out of money at 70 is obviously a terrible outcome, considering he's going to live another 20, 30 plus years. And this really highlights the conventional approach. So we talked a bit about the 4% rule. So the 4% rule is based on a 30-year retirement. So this is consistent with the 4% rule. However, the 4% rule is also based on lower returns. Typically, a 4% rule takes historical data and a certain portfolio mix to arrive at somewhere around, a 6% return. So you can imagine that our scenario is a bit different because let's run the numbers. So 650,000 on a 13,600,000 portfolio, that starts off at a 4.8% withdrawal rate. So if I were to lower the return assumptions and be more aligned with the return assumptions in the 4% rule portfolio, you would see that the portfolio would run out of money even quicker. But because the returns in this are a bit higher, the portfolio does in fact last 30 years. Let's take a look at that. Let's say that we were to go back to the investments and say that the portfolio generates a 6% return, both pre-retirement and after retirement, since this portfolio is comprised entirely after retirement. In that scenario, considering that this portfolio starts at a 4.8% withdrawal rate, which is far too high with no tax planning, you can see here that the portfolio runs out of money in 23 years. All right, even a worse result. Let's test it. So let's say you have a 6% return, and let's say the expenses are actually 4%. I want to test this old conventional wealth management model here. So a 4% withdrawal rate would be 544,000. So let's put that in. 544. And just to be clear, like the 4% rule is never designed or thought of as like something that should be exact. In fact, it's based on simulations and all other types of factors, but I'm always interested in testing things quantitatively. So there you go. A perfect 4% withdrawal rate and 6% returns, which again, is not necessarily discrete or exact given that rule. So what happens? My guess is 30. Yep, lo and behold, 33, 34. So you run out of money around 30, 35 years, okay? So relatively consistent. And again, like all of this is a mosaic. So before we kick over to our proprietary spreadsheet, let's just go back to this model and see how much they could actually spend given no tax planning. So putting the returns back to 7% to keep it consistent, and then going back to the spending, we're going to go back to our exact amount that we started with of 650,000, growing at 2.7%. 650 here and 650 here. So if we go back to the plan, we'll see again, this nice couple runs out of money in 30 years, okay? An interesting feature that they have on this software is you can actually solve for how much money you can spend without running out of money, given the set of assumptions, the maximum retirement spending. So if we run this solver here, you can see that the amount that they can spend starting in year one and then growing at that 2.7% rate is 455,000. So if we plug that into the model, this green bar that shows up here, you can see they don't run out of money until they're 90. So a much more comfortable situation, but far less spending than they actually want to spend to enjoy their life. Let's just level set the example using our proprietary framework. Moving to the sheet, 20% federal tax rate because it's an S-Corp sale with no state tax because it's in Texas. At this juncture, we're going to assume that this person does not utilize our tax saving opportunities in order to match with what we just looked at in the spreadsheet. So let's have a look. No strategy right here, 13.6 million in after-tax proceeds. You have a little bit of a window into how much we reasonably could save this person, $700,000, using investments in order to generate a return that's differentiated first, as well as providing tax benefits in the year of the sale. But let's move on. 13.6 million. The family has indicated that they want to spend $650,000 a year, and they're 40 years old. So let's ignore this tax strategy column for right now and just focus on this. Again, that's a 4.8% withdrawal rate for someone that's only 40 years old. So assuming a 7% after all fee return, that's not likely to be a good outcome. And my guess is they're going to run out of money in around 30 years or so. So lo and behold, oh, and by the way, I've actually already looked at this, so I know that. So if we look at the graph here, this top one, you can see after around 32 years, this family runs out of money, starting at 13.6 million here, all the way down to here, right? And so you can see that holds true, similar to the software that we were just viewing. So let's see what tax planning could do. So if we were to implement a long-short tax loss harvesting strategy in the year of the sale, in order to generate realized capital losses for tax purposes, that is a direct offset to the capital gains from the business sale, while also making money and taking, most importantly, investment exposure and investments in the overall stock market that would be consistent with this type of allocation and this type of investment strategy for someone at this age. So in this example, we assumed a $5 million allocation to long-short tax loss harvesting to generate these realized capital losses. And you can see, based on this estimate, this portfolio would likely generate 3.5 million that could be a direct offset to the $17 million gain this family is going to incur, saving over $700,000 in this estimate. So you can see, instead of starting with $13.6 million, this family now starts with $14.3 million, okay? If we were to think about that $700,000, okay, and you think like, all right, instead of paying our wasteful government that $700,000, what if we invested it and earned 9% over this long 40-year time horizon? It might shock you, but that $700,000 turns into $22 million of extra wealth for you, your family, your children, or any other cause that you're passionate about, that you can then give that money away at that time or use that money to live the life that you want to live. So $22 million that $700,000 turns into. So now you have a portfolio that's $14.3 million, and this family, again, wants to spend $650,000, which is a lower but still high 4.5% withdrawal rate for a family where the husband anyway is 40 years old, okay? Again, we assume a 2.7% growth of expenses, and at 80 years old, those expenses roll over and start to decline modestly at 3%. So what does that look like? Again, 7% returns. Let's see, after 20 years, okay, by factoring those initial tax savings, but then also utilizing our investment tax strategies to not only, first and foremost, like, we're an investment shop. We have a differentiated investment process that can generate investment returns with lower volatility by maintaining geographical and economic diversification. We can talk all about that in another video. But 7% returns, it's the same for both of these bars, but yet after 20 years, you have $22.5 million in this estimate versus $12.7 million. So we're talking about a stark difference after 20 years. And after 40 years, we already talked about the first scenario where spending $650,000, this family runs out of money in 32 years. But because of the tax savings on the sale, okay, which, you know, we talked about over 40 years at 9%, is a $20+ million difference. But in this scenario, it's only 7%. But you can see after 40 years, that $14.3 million, despite spending what they want to spend has turned into $31 million. Okay. And let's dig into that a little bit, because why not, right? So if we look at the tax strategy, the no tax strategy example, I'll make this a little bigger here. If we look at the no tax strategy example, you can see a portfolio that's invested 35% in more income-oriented investments and 65% in more growth-oriented investments. You can see, let's just go to the bottom line on the tax returns. So pre-tax return, 7%, that's what we expect because we've been talking about it. After-tax return, 5.9%. So there's 1.1% initially in tax leakage. And you can see, because more of the portfolio is generating taxable income, you can see in year 10 or so, 7% pre-tax returns and about 5.5% after-tax returns. So you're losing 1.5% to taxes. And I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, right? But if you look at the cumulative taxes over that time here, so year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you've paid $2 million in taxes after 12 years. And if you contrast that to the tax planning scenario, and we've done videos on this, we don't need to get into all those details now, but if you contrast that to the tax strategy portfolio, which again, the goal is investment returns first, 7%, there's no tax drag early on. Some tax drag comes later as the portfolio evolves and as there's more embedded gains, but still, you're looking at a 40 or a 0.4% tax drag in later years. So instead of paying $2 million in taxes, maybe you've paid a couple $100,000. So it's a stark difference. And the point of it is not because we can brag about how much we're saving on taxes. It's so this family can actually lead the life that they want to live after selling their business. So this question comes up whether it's a $5 million transaction or a $100 million transaction, because everybody has a different interpretation on what type of life they want to lead after they sell their business. And so while for some, $650,000 seems like a crazy amount of spending, the person that's selling for $80 million is thinking about $1 million, $2 million in spending and thinking that is completely normal. Whereas I have clients who've just sold their business for $8 million and they're at the grocery store giving me a call thinking that they're just in fear and panic that they shouldn't be spending any money, considering they no longer have their business and they no longer have the cash flow that it provides. This type of analysis helps to put people at ease. They can look at the forecast. They can think about the assumptions. They can look at it without the tax strategy or with the tax strategy in order to gain peace of mind about the path that they're on. But this is a window into some conventional approaches, the software that's attached to it, and then also proprietary approaches that can save money on the taxes up front and save money on taxes so your portfolio doesn't bleed out as it goes to our wasteful state and federal government to pursue various programs or just outright steal it. We're learning more and more. So in future videos, we'll dig in more to some of the investment strategies and maybe some of the nuances of the spending and the various components of that spending. So when you're thinking about your particular situation, your business sale, the life that you really want to lead after the business sale, don't just imagine it. Think about the numbers, run the numbers, and then you can move into that decision with confidence.